Hey guys, Buildzoid here from Actually Hardcore Overclocking, and today we're going to be doing a top 18 motherboard list for the AM4 platform, going all the way from X570 down to, $700 X570 motherboard, there's only one of those, down to as low as a $70 B450 board, basically covering the full spectrum here. So let's get into it because there's quite a lot of boards with there being 18. The first one on the list is the X570 Aorus Xtreme right here.
Before that, this video is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut Liquid Metal. Conductonaut is what we've used in all of our liquid metal and delit thermal tests, capable of dropping CPU thermals significantly when replacing the stock thermal interface. Lower CPU thermals don't just allow better overclocks, but also lower noise levels because the transfer efficiency is increased. The mix of gallium and indium makes for a thermal conductivity of 73 watts per meter Kelvin, outclassing traditional pastes significantly. Learn more at the link in the description below.
And this board got onto the list because it's fully passive. In my opinion, in terms of feature set, you can get, like, if you want 10 gig LAN, there are cheaper options, but this does have 10 gig of Quantia. It also has the 1 gig Intel, but that's standard. The motherboards that have 10 gig typically have dual LAN. It's got 3 M.2 slots. There are cheaper options for that as well. 6 SATA ports, cheaper options for that as well. Wi-Fi 6, cheaper options for that as well. It's got BIOS flashback, clear CMOS on the rear I/O. There's cheaper options if you want those features as well. It's got a postcode. You can get that for as low as around $250. Yeah, like, the only really noteworthy feature that, like, this motherboard has that nothing else has is the fact that it's passive, as in it doesn't have a fan. But in my experience, the X570 chipset fan doesn't really turn on. So I'm not really sure that I would pay $700 to have a motherboard that doesn't have a fan. So anyway, the other thing that is kind of neat about this board is it does have basically the best VRM on X570. However, X570 being the thing is, Ryzen 3000 series CPUs just don't overclock very much. So the fact that this VRM is absolutely amazing is kind of useless. So yeah, like, still, if you want a passive motherboard, or you just have way too much money and you run out of things to spend it on, this is my favorite option for a $700 motherboard, because it does do basically everything. The only thing it doesn't do is it doesn't have Thunderbolt 3. And that's why the X570 Creator got onto the list. Now, compared to the Xtreme, you do lose 2 M.2 slots, but this does have Thunderbolt 3. It has the 10 gig LAN. It still has a postcode. It has a power button, reset button, clear CMOS, BIOS flashback functionality. The VRM here is a 12-phase instead of the 14. Well, actually, I don't know why we're going into the details. The VRM on this is just worse than the VRM on the Xtreme, but by not a significant amount. And again, the Ryzen 3000 doesn't really overclock. So it's really kind of like academic that there's the VRM on this is inferior. Anyway, this goes for around $500, and really, if you're looking for the Thunderbolt 3 and the 10 gig LAN, this is basically your best option. Assuming you also want it on X570, because there is an even cheaper way to get the 10 gig LAN as well as the Thunderbolt 3, though you can't get both of them at once if you're going cheaper. So anyway, that's the X570 Creator. It's just here because it offers the sort of most advanced package of connectivity with the Thunderbolt 3 and the 10 gig, and of course it still has all of the usual overclocking features. So moving on from that, we have the X570 Aorus Master. This VRM is based on the VRM of the X570 Aorus Xtreme. It's just downgraded in terms of maximum current handling capability, but the control scheme is still the same. So the VRM on this thing is absolutely great, as useless as that is on the Ryzen 3000 platform. You've got your postcode, it's got dual BIOS. Oh, I think I forgot to mention, yeah, the Xtreme has dual BIOS, which is kind of a unique feature to Gigabyte motherboards. Most board vendors don't bother with it these days. Yeah, but this has dual BIOS, it's got a postcode, clear CMOS, BIOS flashback functionality, 2.5 gig LAN, 1 gig LAN, 3 M.2 slots, 6 SATA ports. It's basically the Xtreme minus the fact that it's not passive. And it's not completely passive. It's still going to be mostly passive anyway. It's not like the fan has to turn on that often. In my experience, it never does, except if you reset the CMOS anyway, for initial startup. So yeah, it's basically an Xtreme minus the 10 gig and minus the passive chipset cooler. and then the VRM is a slight downgrade. That's it. Like, there's really very little difference between these two boards, and this goes for around $360, so about half the price of the Xtreme while doing basically everything the Xtreme does, which is why the only reason the Xtreme got onto the list is because it's passive. Now, if you hate Gigabyte motherboards for whatever reason, I don't really care. There's just people who don't like the BIOS and other things. Another solid option would be the ROG Crosshair 8 Hero. This is a very different approach to the VRM design. This only has 7 phases in total, but it's actually still a really great VRM. It's just ASUS does their VRMs differently. I'm not going to go into details on why. Ultimately, it doesn't matter. Like, the VRM on this is still great. It's just not like this is a 12 phase, that's a 12 phase, that's a 14. This is a 7 for the vCore portion. The SoC portion doesn't really matter. So anyway, you know, so the VRM on this is still really, really great. You still have your postcode. This doesn't have the dual BIOS. It does have BIOS flashback. It does have clear CMOS. Instead of 3 M.2 slots, you get only 2, but you do get 8 SATA ports instead of 6, so that's kind of neat. This also has a safe boot button and a retry button, which are, for me, the highlight features with this motherboard, because while safe boot can be extremely handy if you're messing around with like memory overclocking and you're not particularly great at it, or if you just don't remember to save profiles. Other than that, like, it still has the 2.5 gig LAN as well as the 1 gig LAN. It still has the Wi-Fi 6, which the Master also had. Like, this is basically the ASUS version of a Master. The one downside to this board is that if you buy it with Wi-Fi, it's $380 with the Wi-Fi, so it's $20 more expensive than the Master in general. And if you buy it without the Wi-Fi, then you can get it for $360, which the Master is always with the Wi-Fi. There's no option for a non-Wi-Fi version, and the Master's always $360. So yeah, that's kind of the thing. You, like, if you don't use the Wi-Fi, like, these two boards are equivalent in terms of price point. If you do want the Wi-Fi, this is a little bit cheaper. Anyway, so moving on, next we get the X570 UNIFY. The reason why this gets onto the list is this is a great overclocking board. You've got a solid 12-phase VRM, very similar to what you get on the Creator, which is technically inferior to the 12-phase on this. So yeah, this is like basically the same 12-phase that you'd get on the X570 Creator from ASRock. It's got BIOS flashback, it's got clear CMOS, it's got a postcode, power button, reset button. The one downside to this motherboard is it's only got 4 SATA ports, but it does have 3 M.2 slots. So basically, if you just want really good if you just want overclocking features, and you don't really care about advanced connectivity or anything like that, because the other thing this sacrifices is you do only have 2.5 gig LAN. You don't get dual LAN, so you don't get a 1 gig. But this still has the Wi-Fi 6. So, you know, if you don't need 2 LAN ports, then this is a solid option as well. And this comes in at $300. So, you know, if you want a cheaper, you know, very capable overclocking board, this is it, the X570 UNIFY. Again, though, like, you'll only really make it, like, this board will only give you a real advantage if you're on like a 3950X or a 3900X. Anyway, so going down from the UNIFY, you could go with the ASRock X570 Taichi, which offers a very similar feature set in that it has the clear CMOS, it has the postcode, it has the reset power button, BIOS flashback functionality. This only has 2 M.2 slots, and instead of 4 SATA ports, it has 8 SATA ports. So more SATA, less M.2. The VRM on this is a slight downgrade compared to what the MSI board is running, as this is on 50 amp power stages, whereas the MSI board's on 60s. Not that that's a particularly useful difference, because both VRMs are more than capable of powering even a 3950X. This, instead of having the UNIFY has 2.5 gig LAN, this is on 1 gig, and this still has Wi-Fi 6. Now, this board is even cheaper than the UNIFY. So this goes for around $300 to $260 when it's on sale, which it tends to be pretty regularly. Which is why this gets onto the list, because if you want things like the postcode and just a solid VRM and just all of the different overclocking features, this is the cheapest motherboard you can get them on. The biggest downside, in my opinion, is that instead of having MSI BIOS or Gigabyte BIOS or ASUS BIOS, which in my opinion are all better BIOSes than ASRock BIOS, well, you're stuck with ASRock BIOS because this is an ASRock board. That is not to say that the ASRock BIOS is it's not so much. Funny thing about ASRock BIOS, it tends to have more settings in it than the other boards. It's just that you kind of take a gamble on how many of those settings actually work, and the BIOS is generally kind of clunky. So that's the thing. I like. It's kind of messy. It's like the organization of the BIOS is kind of awful. Sometimes things that should work don't work. Sometimes things that, like, I've seen, like, the issue is, like, on really low-end ASRock boards, I've run into BIOSes where it's, like, there are settings in the BIOS that the motherboard physically doesn't support, and it's just, like, they forgot to remove that. Like, why is this here? So, ASRock's BIOS is kind of not great. But if you can live with it, you can save, if you can live with ASRock BIOS, you can save like another $40 over something like the UNIFY, which this has MSI BIOS, which in my opinion is generally for the AM4 platform, one of the easy, actually, no, any platform. I really like the MSI BIOS for a while now. So since like X99, it's been one of my favorite BIOSes to use. So yeah, I would take the MSI BIOS any day of the week over the ASRock one, but hey, if you can live with the ASRock one, this is a cheaper option to get a very similar feature set to the UNIFY. So that's why that gets onto the list. Next, we have the X470 Taichi Ultimate. The only reason this gets onto the list is it tends to go for around $270, and it has 10 gig LAN. Now, the VRM on this is another step down in significance still, because honestly, the VRMs on all of these higher end boards are kind of ridiculous overkill. But another slight step down in VRM again. Still has a postcode, still has power button, reset button, clear CMOS, BIOS flashback support. The biggest downside with this motherboard I can think of is that this is on a T topology memory layout, and I'm pretty sure this one's actually just bad. So, because I have an X370 Taichi, which is also a T topology. I don't believe ASRock ever redesigned the memory layout. The memory overclocking experience on the X370 Taichi is not great. I've heard from other people that the X470 Taichi is also not that great. So you might find that memory overclocking on this is going to be kind of painful. Whereas I have tested an X570 Taichi that's on a daisy chain. It's just like, it's great. But this is a T topology, and I don't really think it's down to the topology. I just think ASRock screwed something up with the board in general. So, well, something with the memory, either BIOS side or topology side. It's just this board is probably the most the likeliest to give you memory issues. However, if you just want 10 gig LAN, this is the cheapest way to get it. And you'll have memory issues at like over 3200 megahertz. Up to 3200, it's fine. The X470. And actually, with Ryzen 3rd Gen's memory controller, it'll probably be fine all the way up to 3600. But yeah, it's just like, if you buy this, hopefully you're more experienced with memory overclocking than not. Like, if you're not experienced with memory overclocking, this is probably a bad idea. Anyway, moving on, we have the ROG Strix X570i Gaming. This is literally the best VRM you can get on an ITX motherboard on AM4, and that's why it's on the list. Being an ITX motherboard, it has absolutely no overclocking features except for a couple color-coded LEDs for troubleshooting. And yeah, there's no BIOS flashback, clear CMOS, nothing like that. There's there's a jumper, but you don't get any like buttons for anything. So yeah, it's an ITX board. There's just not enough space for that kind of thing. But if you just want an ITX board where you can really just push a 3950X to the limit, this is it. Because all the other boards have weaker power delivery systems than this. So yeah, and this tends to go for around $250. Now then, moving on, another ITX board that's noteworthy is the X570 Phantom Gaming ITX/TB3. Now, big downside with this motherboard is that this does have LGA mounting holes for some reason, so mounting heatsinks on this thing is going to be an adventure. However, it does come with Thunderbolt 3, and it tends to go for around $220. The VRM on this is actually worse than what you would get on the Strix board, so if you just want to overclock, get the Strix. Also, it's worth noting that the ASUS board is advertised as supporting 4800 megahertz, and the ASRock board is advertised as supporting only 4500 4533. This is rather low for an ITX motherboard in general. Like, ITX boards should generally be better at memory overclocking than similarly priced ATX boards, so the fact that this is advertised as 4533 is not exactly confidence-inspiring. At the same time, on Ryzen 3rd Gen, as long as you can go up to like 3800 megahertz, it doesn't really matter that you can't go past it. So yeah, it's just that like if you want to overclock basically for the sake of overclocking, this is going to be the better board because this seems to have the superior memory support. This, on the other hand, is just like, it has Thunderbolt 3, and that's really the only reason I would consider buying it for. So yeah, anyway, moving on again, we've got the X570 Aorus Elite. Now, at this point, we're down to $200 to $170. The Elite comes with or without Wi-Fi, depending on how much you want to spend. Without the Wi-Fi, it's a bit cheaper. With the Wi-Fi, it tends to be a little bit more expensive, so closer to that $200 price. You get a really solid VRM. You get two M.2 slots, you get 6 SATA ports, you don't get any troubleshooting features whatsoever. There's no LEDs, nothing. And some people might be like, oh, but you can buy a little speaker, or your case might come with the speaker. And it's just like, yeah, but the speaker beeps at you, and that's obnoxious in my opinion. So, yeah, I much prefer LEDs for troubleshooting, and this doesn't have any. But it is still a, solid motherboard in terms of just like the power delivery. And it still comes with like Intel LAN. The rear I/O is good. So this is definitely like if you don't mind the lack of troubleshooting features, this is kind of my go-to motherboard for X570 because it's $200 to $170, right? So it's pretty cheap. It kind of does everything. Yeah, this is a really great option. Now, at this price point, you could also consider the tough gaming X570 Plus Wi-Fi with or without Wi-Fi from ASUS. This tends to go for around $200 to $170 as well, so literally the same price range as the Elite. This has some troubleshooting LEDs that are color-coded. The VRM on this is a very different approach, but somewhat similar results in terms of power handling. Well, actually, the same results in terms of power handling capability. Slight advantage in terms of actual voltage regulation. The thing with this board is instead of the 1 gig Intel, you get Realtek LAN. So, I personally prefer Intel LAN. So that's kind of that. And yeah, but still, if you're going to use the Wi-Fi, then I'd actually probably just go for the Wi-Fi version of the TUF. And if you're not going to use the Wi-Fi, well, you could probably still go for the TUF anyway, right? Like, it's still got the two M.2 slots. It actually comes with 8 SATA ports instead of just 6. So, yeah, like, between these two, you could flip a coin, and it would be a perfectly good purchasing decision, in my opinion, to choose one of these based on a coin flip. Because personally, I don't really see... Like, you might prefer ASUS BIOS, you might prefer Gigabyte BIOS. Either one is completely fine. And these are really my kind of go-to motherboards on X570 because they just kind of do everything you need, and they're affordable. They're $200 to $170, right? So at least by X570 motherboard standards, that's affordable. So anyway, then we've got the last X570 motherboard, and this is the Prime X570-P. The reason why this gets onto the list is because this has the same VRM that you would get on a Maximus 11 Hero. Actually, even a Maximus 11 Formula technically has a very similar VRM to this. So at this price point, which this goes for around $170 to $150, this has the best VRM you can get at this price point. So if you want to, just buy a 3950, like, this doesn't have any troubleshooting features. It doesn't come with Wi-Fi. The rear I/O is rather stripped down. It's not that bad though. You still get a total of 8 USB ports. You only get your 1 gig Realtek LAN. The audio section is barely even visible on the motherboard because it's so stripped down. But yeah, if you don't care about any of that, right, and you just want your 2 PCIe slots and your 2 M.2 slots as well as 8 SATA ports, this is a really solid option as far as motherboards go, in my opinion. Like, if you just want to push around a 3950X or 3900X in terms of overclocking, and you want to do some memory overclocking, this is a really solid option. In fact, in terms of overclocking, it should behave very, very similar to how the X570 TUF Gaming Plus does. While costing another, $20 less. Well, well, it kind of depends on what you see the price, but generally about $30 to $20 less. So yeah, not much of a loss in terms of anything. It's just yeah, cheap. Like this is a really great board in terms of, well, the build quality. Like at this price point, you're just not going to find a better built board, and that's kind of that. So this also makes a lot of the cheaper X470 motherboards, like if you're considering those, I would just get this instead. Right. Similarly, if you're just considering like cheaper X370 motherboards that might be on sale, I would still just get this instead, assuming they're at a similar price. So, yeah, really, really like if you just need the motherboard to do motherboard things and no extras, this is it. Anyway, now we get into the B450 motherboards, and we're going to start off with the B450i Gaming Plus from MSI. This is the best B450 ITX motherboard you can buy. In terms of VRM and kind of in terms of features as well. All right, you've got a solid rear I/O option. You've got your Wi-Fi. You've got the VRM on this is a 6-phase using a bunch of international rectifier 60 amp power stages. You also get a 2-phase SoC VRM. Like honestly, this is like if they made this as a M-ATX motherboard, it would be my go-to M-ATX B450 motherboard as well. So yeah, this is the best option in terms of ITX B450 motherboards, and it tends to go for around $125. It also manages to fit a couple troubleshooting LEDs right above the CPU socket. They are all single color, but you know, at least you have something to tell what part of the boot process the motherboard is in. Which is pretty useful when you're doing overclocking. So that's why it gets onto the list. Next, and honestly, I would actually, well, the thing is, as far as what CPUs I'd install into this, a 3700X should be absolutely no problem. With a 3900X or 3950X, if you decide to overclock them, it's really going to depend how much airflow you're giving that VRM, because it is capable. It's just that really depends on how much airflow you have. So, yeah, because the thing is with ITX motherboards, it's not so much about what components make up the VRM, it's just like how is the VRM actually being cooled, which in a lot of cases it's just kind of not, because it's too small and there's no airflow. So that's kind of that. Anyway, next we have the MSI B450 Tomahawk Max. Now this thing is... So this motherboard goes for around $120, and unfortunately, it's not that great in terms of feature set. You only get one M.2 slot, a total of 6 SATA ports. The rear I/O is also not that great, in my opinion, right? Like, you only get, what is it, like 5 normal USB ports and then a Type-C. But this does have BIOS flashback, and it has one of the best VRMs on B450, as in... You have that heatsink, you've got proper voltage control support, which, like, that's actually a big deal at this price range, because, like, the Gigabyte motherboards on B450, the voltage control is painful, very painful. So, yeah, a board like the thing is, if you want to do, like, if you want to mess around with overclocking, I would go for this, but the feature set on this is kind of limited, which brings me to the B450 Mortar Max. Now, the problem with the B450M Mortar Max is that it's not in, like, I've never seen it in stock in the US. In the UK, it goes for around 100 to 90 pounds, so it's really not that expensive, and it has one of the best feature sets of any B450 motherboard out there. You get your solid VRM, you got the nice VRM heatsink, you've got, you know, troubleshooting LEDs, which this also has. You've got, you know, only 4 SATA ports, which is kind of a downside, but it does have 2 M.2 slots. The rear I/O doesn't look like a complete disaster. It's got BIOS flashback support, and since it's a Max board, it actually gets the fully fledged MSI BIOS instead of just the stripped down one. So this is a really, really great motherboard, and I really wish it was available. Like, if this was available in the US, I would just go like, this is the B450 motherboard you should buy, unless there's something very, very specific that this doesn't do, because this board is, like, this is literally, as far as I'm concerned, this is literally better than the Tomahawk. Like, I don't get why MSI isn't shipping these to the US, because it is better than the, like, it is better in terms of, it's, well, on par, in terms of features, it tends to be on par with some of the ATX boards, but the VRM is just better than everything else except, like, the Tomahawk and then MSI's own B450 Gaming Pro Carbon. So, like, I have no idea why it's so hard to find one of these, but these are freaking awesome. Though in Europe, they're actually readily available. It's just in the US that you seem to get screwed on MATX motherboards. So, yeah. Now, if you do want a motherboard with some features, and don't really care about overclocking whatsoever, there's the B450 Aorus Elite. And I say overclocking whatsoever because the VRM on the, like, if you start trying to overclock with this and you realize that the voltage control is just weird and your voltage readings don't make any sense, and that's just a problem with this VRM. That's basically why I don't recommend B450 Gigabyte boards. But I can't deny that, the rear I/O on this is rather decent, and it does have two M.2 slots, which the Tomahawk doesn't have. And this tends to go for around $110. So that's why it gets onto the list, because it actually has a decent feature set. It's not really that expensive. And it does still have troubleshooting LEDs as well as 6 SATA ports, though they are very awkward because you have 2 of them up there. Then you have 2 down here, and then 2 more in the middle over here. So they're just kind of all over the board. But at least they're there. So yeah, it's not really like my favorite. Like, I would not, if you have any plans of overclocking, I would really, like, memory, you'll be fine. It's CPU overclocking on this is going to be a horrible mess. And if you're not experienced with dealing with low-end Gigabyte motherboards, because if you know how to deal with low-end Gigabyte motherboards, it's not that bad. It's just that if you've never dealt with the things that these boards do, you're going to have no idea what's going on. And it's going to be really, really frustrating. So yeah, but if you just never touch the overclocking settings for the CPU, then you'll be fine. And PBO will still work. Like, PBO doesn't count as overclocking because you're basically just telling AMD's automatic boost algorithm to do more boost. So I don't consider that overclocking because you're still within you're extending the AMD specification a bit. Anyway. Next, we've got the B450 Gaming Plus Max. So this gets onto the list because the Tomahawk's $120. This is $100. This still has the same, similar rear I/O. I'd argue this is a better rear I/O because this actually has 6 useful-sized USB ports instead of the Type-C. And I know the Type-C is supposed to be like the USB of the future, but honestly, I don't have anything that plugs into a Type-C except my phone, and the charger ends in a regular USB plug, so that's not helpful. So yeah, this only has one M.2 slot, but this does have the same VRM as the Tomahawk. It just downgrades the VRM heatsinks. It has BIOS flashback. It's got troubleshooting LEDs. Honestly, the overclocking experience on this is going to be really, really nice. It's just that, yeah, you give up quite a lot of features. It does have 6 SATA ports. It's just like, yeah, you don't have multiple M.2 slots. That's really the biggest downside with this board. If it had one more M.2 slot, this would kind of be my go-to, as well as if it had a few more USB ports. Anyway, this thing tends to go for around $100, so yeah, if you just want to have overclocking support that isn't painful, this is the best option. And that brings us to the last board in my list, and that's the B450 Aorus M. It could be worse, and that's why this motherboard got onto the list. It could be worse. The rear I/O is actually not a complete disaster. You get an M.2 slot, and you actually even get a heatsink for the M.2, so that's kind of impressive. 4 SATA ports in total, and does have troubleshooting LEDs. It also has dual BIOS, which interestingly enough, the Elite, for whatever reason, doesn't have dual BIOS. Don't ask me how that works, like, seriously. Feature decisions at various motherboard vendors don't make a lot of sense a lot of the time. But yeah, this has the same VRM as the B450 Aorus Elite. So all of the issues that I said the Elite would have, yeah, this would have them too in terms of voltage control. So again, I would not recommend this if you're a beginner to overclocking, because it's just not going to make any sense, because Gigabyte's voltage controller on these boards just behaves weird, and it breaks things like software voltage readings. Like, that's the biggest issue, is just like, you're going to make a voltage adjustment, you're going to have the CPU running a static overclock, and your voltage readings are just not going to make any sense, because I don't actually know what they did. I don't know how they got that. Oh wait, it has 6 SATA ports. So yeah, you get a decent set of features. I would just not overclock on this whatsoever. So yeah, but at $70, like, the thing is, you can still go down maybe another $20, but at that point you're getting motherboards with no VRM heatsinks, barely any USB ports, barely any SATA ports, really barely anything on the motherboard at that point. Like, you're paying for having a CPU socket and a power connector. So yeah, those are boards that I would just, below this, I would just avoid the motherboards completely. So yeah, that's the top 18 AM4 motherboards for 2019 winter, in my opinion. You know, my biggest highlights, I would say, like this is literally the best B450 motherboard in terms of price point, feature set, VRM, everything. Like, this is great. I don't know why it's so hard to find in the US. And then for X570, I'd say Tough or the Elite. Those are sort of the highlight boards. Then I'd probably say UNIFY if you want an overclocking experience that's really nice, but don't want to spend more than $300. And then this, because of the connectivity, that's, you know, this is a really cool board because of the combination of the Thunderbolt 3 as well as the 10 gig LAN. So if you're kind of building a workstation that needs those two things, well, you don't really have any other options because this is the only board that comes with both of them at the same time. So yeah, those are sort of my four absolute highlights out of this list. But really, any motherboard on this list except like the bottom, well, these two, these two are terrible for overclocking. So like the bottom three are where it's like I don't like those very much, but people complain if I don't recommend motherboards below $100. So here's your motherboard below $100. Anyway, yeah, that's my B450. I mean, AM4 motherboard highlights list is just like, and honestly, like if you're not overclocking, you can arguably put even a 3950X into something like this. The thing is, I fully expect your CPU to throttle if you run all-core workloads. Like, it will not boost as much as if you actually had a proper motherboard. And by a proper motherboard, I mean something like this. Because this can actually handle up to around 150, 200 watts of CPU power consumption. This can't. Okay, and that's kind of the thing, is just like the 3900X, the 3950X, they will actually boost to around 140 watts if the motherboard is capable of supporting that. And well, yeah, if the motherboard's not capable of supporting that, they will slow down into the 105 watt TDP that they're normally rated for. So that's kind of the thing, is like the AMD CPUs, they perform differently depending on which motherboard you install them in. So if you install them in something really low end, they're going to slow down. And if you want to overclock, then you really should be looking at, you know, especially if you're looking at like overclocking the 12 core or the 16 core, at the bare minimum, I would get this. Ideally, you'd go for like a Tough or an Elite, but the bare minimum would be this. And then, you know, upwards, it's just like, you know, well, you want things like a postcode, you want things like a VRM that's that's gonna run ice cold no matter what, right? That kind of thing. That's what you start getting into with the, you know, $300 boards. So, yeah. Anyway, that's the AM4 lineup. AM4 highlights done. So thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comment section below. And if you'd like to support us here at Gamers Nexus, we've got a Patreon where you can support us directly. There's a link to that down in the description. And then there's, of course, store.gamersnexus.net where you can pick up Gamers Nexus merch like mod mats, shirts, glasses, that kind of thing. For glasses for like drinking, not for eyes. So yeah, that's it for the video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.